The letter arrived on a normal afternoon, mixed in with grocery ads and a power bill. The homeowner almost tossed it aside without opening it. He had just returned from work, tired, shoes still on, mind already drifting toward dinner and rest. Nothing in his day hinted that something was about to change. When he finally opened the envelope, his eyes paused on one number, $3.900. At first he thought it was a mistake. Maybe a medical bill meant for someone else. Maybe a printing error. He read the page again, slower this time. The letter claimed he owed the Homeowners Association a fine for multiple violations. It listed things like unauthorized exterior use, failure to comply with HOA standards, and repeated disregard for notices. His stomach tightened. He had received no warnings, no prior letters, no emails, no knock on the door. He followed the rules, or at least he believed he did. He kept his place clean. His trash cans were hidden. His yard was neat. He didn't build anything new or paint anything without approval. He rarely even spoke to the HOA. He sat down on the couch, letter in hand, and read it a third time. At the bottom was a signature from a board member. The same woman neighbors quietly warned each other about. She was known for walking around with a clipboard, watching homes like they were crime scenes. She'd fine people for planters being an inch too wide and curtains being the wrong shade. People called her strict, but some used another word when they felt safe enough. Controlling the homeowner had crossed paths with her before, though only briefly. Once, she told him his garage door stayed open too long during the day. Another time, she warned him about a package sitting on his porch for too many hours. He had nodded, kept polite, and thought nothing of it. He didn't argue. He didn't complain. He never imagined it would turn into this. The letter stated the fine was due in 14 days. If unpaid, additional fees would apply. It also mentioned possible legal action, liens, and restrictions on property use. The words were heavy, meant to scare. And they worked, at least at first. He felt heat rise in his chest. Not anger yet, but confusion mixed with worry. He thought about his savings, his bills, his plans for the next few months. $3,900 was not a small amount. It wasn't something he could just write off. Still, he didn't panic. He set the letter on the table and took a deep breath. He reminded himself that letters could be wrong. People could be wrong. He decided to check the details before reacting. He read through the violations carefully. One claimed he stored commercial equipment in his driveway. He didn't own any such thing. Another accused him of altering common areas. He hadn't touched anything beyond his own space. A third said he ignored multiple notices, yet he had none to show. That was when the confusion turned into something sharper. He picked up his phone and searched his email, including spam. Nothing. He checked old mail. Nothing. No warnings. No notices. Just this sudden demand? The next morning, he called the HOA office. The number rang several times before someone answered. He calmly explained he had received a fine and wanted clarification. The response was cold. He was told the fine was valid and approved. When he asked for evidence, he was told it had already been reviewed. When he asked for copies of prior notices, he was told they were on record. No one offered to send them. No one explained further. Then the voice on the phone said something that stayed with him. If you don't pay on time, the consequences will be worse. It wasn't advice. It was a threat. Later that day, while checking his mail again, he saw her. The board member stood across the street, talking to another neighbor. She noticed him and smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was tight, knowing, almost satisfied. She crossed the street without hesitation. "I assume you got the letter," she said. He nodded. "Yes, I did." "Good," she replied. "Then you know what's expected." He kept his voice steady. "I'm asking for proof. I don't understand what these violations are based on." Her expression changed slightly, as if she wasn't used to being questioned. "We've already reviewed everything." The board agreed. "I'd still like to see the notices," he said. She sighed loudly, clearly annoyed. "You homeowners always think you're special. The rules apply to everyone. I'm not saying they don't, he replied. I just want to understand. She leaned in closer. Pay the fine, or it gets much harder for you. Then she walked away. That moment was when something clicked inside him. Not fear, not anger. Resolve. He realized she expected him to panic, to pay quickly, to avoid trouble. She believed her authority was enough to end the conversation. But he wasn't the type to rush into decisions based on pressure. That evening, he pulled out his HOA handbook and began reading it carefully, page by page. Most people never read those documents fully. He had skimmed them when he moved in years ago. Now, he read every line. He noticed something important. Fines were supposed to follow a process. Written notice. Time to correct. Opportunity to respond. A hearing, if requested. None of that had happened. He also remembered something else. When he bought the property, there had been legal paperwork involved, including a past dispute between the HOA and a previous owner. At the time, it didn't seem important. Now, it felt worth revisiting. The next day, he went through his old files. Deeds, court papers, letters from years ago. He found a copy of a court order, stamped and official. He didn't fully understand it yet, but it mentioned limits on HOA enforcement related to certain areas of the property. He didn't jump to conclusions. He knew better than that. But he sensed this wasn't as simple as the board member wanted it to be. Over the following days, more letters arrived. Reminders, warnings, each one more aggressive than the last. The fine amount stayed the same, but the language grew harsher. Words like final notice and immediate action were bolded. Neighbors started asking questions. One mentioned she had been fined recently for something minor, then had it dropped after complaining. Another said the same board member tried to fine him years ago, but backed off when he asked for a hearing. Patterns began to form. Still, the homeowner didn't confront her again. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue in public. He documented everything. Dates, times, words used. Letters received. He made copies and stored them safely. He also contacted a local legal clinic for advice. Not to start a fight, but to understand his rights. The person he spoke to listened carefully and told him something that surprised him. Don't pay yet, they said. If what you're saying is accurate, this doesn't follow proper procedure. That advice settled his nerves. Meanwhile, the board member seemed more confident than ever. She walked around the neighborhood with her clipboard, stopping occasionally to glance toward his home. Once, she spoke loudly about setting examples and keeping order. It was clear she believed the fine would stand. What she didn't know was that he had already decided not to back down quietly. He wasn't looking for revenge. He wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. He simply wanted fairness. And if that meant taking the long road, he was ready. As the deadline approached, the pressure increased. Another letter arrived, warning of added penalties. He read it, folded it neatly, and placed it with the others. He knew this was only the beginning. The fine wasn't just about money anymore. It was about power, control, and whether one person could bend rules without consequence. And as he looked at the growing stack of papers on his table, he understood something important. This wasn't going to end the way she expected. The next morning, the homeowner woke to the sound of birds and distant lawnmowers. It seemed like a normal day, but he knew it wasn't. The $3,900 fine was still looming over him, growing larger in his mind with each passing hour. The board member, AHOA Karen, as neighbors had quietly called her, was already in motion, and he had no idea what she might do next. He had thought that after one letter or one confrontation, the matter would settle itself. Instead, more letters arrived, each more aggressive than the last. Late fees were mentioned, threats of liens, and even vague hints about legal consequences. She was clearly trying to intimidate him. Instead of feeling fear, he felt determination. He had to approach this carefully. Panic or anger would not help him, and reacting emotionally might give her the advantage. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, spreading out the letters, the HOA handbook, and the old court documents he had found. He read each one carefully, underlining passages, taking notes, and marking discrepancies. It became clear to him that the board member was ignoring proper procedure. She had no record of warnings or hearings. There was no proof that he had violated any rules. Each letter repeated the same claims, but offered nothing substantial. And yet she continued to push. Confident that her position alone would force him to pay, the tension in the neighborhood grew as well. Other residents started whispering about what was happening. A neighbor came over one evening, casually mentioning how she had once been fined by the same board member for something minor, only to have it dropped after she had challenged it. Another neighbor said he had seen similar behavior from HOA Karen years ago, had learned to keep quiet to avoid confrontation. The homeowner listened carefully, realizing that this woman had a pattern. She relied on fear, loud threats, and the assumption that most people wouldn't fight back. Her reputation as strict and controlling had made many neighbors hesitant to speak up, but he wasn't most people. He wanted fairness, not fear, and he was willing to take the time to make that happen. Meanwhile, Karen's actions became more visible. She would walk the streets with her clipboard, making notes on homes, talking to other neighbors in sharp tones, and sometimes pausing near his property. He noticed her glances, her pointed remarks, and the subtle messages she sent. She wanted him to feel watched. She wanted him to feel powerless, but he refused to give her that satisfaction. Every time he saw her, he remained calm. He didn't respond to her glares or her pointed comments. He didn't confront her in public, and he certainly didn't react with anger. Instead, he documented everything. Every interaction, every letter, every email, every phone call. He created a careful record, knowing that one day it could be important. He also began to do research on HOA procedures and legal requirements. He discovered that in his state, an HOA could not levy fines without proper notice and opportunity to respond. He reread the handbook, confirming that the board member had ignored several steps. No warnings had been issued, no formal review had taken place, and no hearing had been offered. The process she claimed to follow simply did not exist. This realization gave him confidence, but he remained cautious. HOA Karen was unpredictable, and he needed to be strategic. He drafted letters requesting clarification and evidence, sending them through certified mail. Each time, her responses were vague and dismissive. She claimed the board had reviewed everything and that he was responsible for paying, but he knew better. One afternoon, he decided to visit the HOA office in person. He walked up to the building, confident but polite, carrying copies of his documentation. Inside, the receptionist seemed surprised to see him. He asked to speak with someone about the fine and requested evidence supporting the claim. The board member herself appeared shortly afterward. Her expression was sharp, her tone clipped. "I don't have time for this," she said. "The fine stands. The board has approved it. I'm asking for proof," he said calmly. "I want to understand the violations. I want to follow the process correctly." Her eyes narrowed. "You've already been notified. You've ignored the notices." "Haven't received any notices," he replied. "I need proper documentation before I can comply." For a moment, she was silent. Then she turned and walked away, muttering something about wasting time. He made a note of the interaction, including the time, date, and her words. He left the office knowing that she believed she had the upper hand. But he also knew that he was building a solid case. Back home, he reviewed the conversation. It was clear that she relied on intimidation and assumed compliance. Most people would have paid immediately, afraid of the consequences. But he had patience and records, and he intended to use them. Over the next few days, the tension in the neighborhood became more noticeable. Other residents whispered when they passed his house, some quietly offering support, others warning him to be careful. He realized he wasn't alone, and that gave him a sense of reassurance. HOA Karen continued her efforts. Letters piled up on his porch. One morning, he found a notice taped to his door, bold letters warning of immediate action if the fine was not paid. The message was clear. She wanted him to feel trapped. She wanted him to panic. Instead, he remained calm. He gathered all the letters, cross-referenced them with the handbook and legal documents, and created a timeline of events. Each entry highlighted discrepancies, missing steps, and procedural errors. By the end of the day, he had a detailed record showing that the fine had no legal foundation. That evening, he reached out to a local legal clinic. He explained the situation, showing copies of letters and documentation. The attorney he spoke with listened carefully and confirmed his suspicions. The HOA Karen had not followed proper procedures, and the fine could likely be challenged successfully. "You have a solid case," the attorney said. "Do not pay. Document everything. You keep calm. The evidence is on your side." His confidence grew, but he also knew that the board member would not give up easily. She thrived on control and intimidation, and she would escalate if she felt challenged. The key, he realized, was patience. She expected fear and quick payment, but he would give her neither. In the following days, he noticed subtle changes in her behavior. She became more visible, walking past his home more often, speaking louder to neighbors, and making her presence felt. She still assumed she had control, but he began to see cracks in her confidence. He also began connecting with neighbors more. Quiet conversations in yards, brief exchanges at the mailbox, small hints of shared experience. Others had faced her tactics before. Some had been forced to pay fines unfairly. Some had backed down out of fear. But now, they watched as someone refused to yield. One neighbor, who had been quiet for years, approached him one morning. "I've seen what she does," they said. "Most people just pay. It's not fair. You're not alone if you decide to challenge her." The homeowner nodded, grateful for the support. It wasn't about confrontation. It was about fairness. And the more people he quietly connected with, the more he realized that HOA Karen's power relied on isolation. If people stopped fearing her, her authority would weaken as days turned into a week. The pressure continued, but he stayed methodical. Every letter, every threat, every interaction was documented. Every claim she made was checked against the rules. Every possible loophole passed ruling. And procedural requirement was noted. By the end of the second week, he felt a quiet sense of control. The fine was still there, looming, but it no longer had the power to intimidate him. He knew that patience, careful documentation, and understanding the rules were stronger than fear. HOA Karen, however, remained unaware of how prepared he was becoming. She assumed that loud letters, threats, and her visible presence would break him. She had never encountered someone willing to calmly challenge her over every detail. She had built her reputation on fear, and now she was facing the first real resistance in years. He looked at the growing stack of papers on his desk, evidence of careful preparation. The letters, the handbook, the court documents, the notes, and the records of each interaction. They were all part of his plan, not a revenge plan, not a confrontation plan, but a plan to ensure fairness and justice. And he knew, deep down, that HOA Karen was about to realize something important. Not everyone could be intimidated. Not everyone would bend to threats. And patience, preparation, and calm persistence could turn the tables. Even against the loudest and most controlling opponent, the tension continued, but the homeowner felt ready. He had learned how HOA Karen operated, how she relied on fear, and how icily she assumed compliance. Now, with the right knowledge, the right documentation, and quiet support from the neighborhood, he was no longer a passive target. He was preparing for what was coming next. And in that preparation, he found a quiet strength. The homeowner spent the next few days quietly reviewing everything he had gathered. The letters, the notices or lack of notices, the HOA handbook, and the old court documents. Every detail mattered. He had become meticulous, writing down dates, times, and conversations, ensuring nothing could be questioned. It was like building a puzzle, piece by piece, till a clear picture began to emerge. He realized that the fine was not just unfair, it was invalid. The process had been completely ignored. He also began noticing a pattern in the board member's actions. She seemed confident because she assumed no one would challenge her. Most residents either paid or ignored her, and that gave her power. but he wasn't most residents. He wanted evidence, fairness, and clarity. One evening, he decided to speak with a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. The office was small, tucked between a cafe and a bookstore, but the lawyer's reputation was solid. The receptionist led him to a modest office where he met someone patient and precise. He laid out everything he had: letters, timelines, documents, and notes on interactions. The lawyer listened carefully, nodding. "You've done well documenting everything. Most people don't take the time to organize their evidence like this." He paused. "From what I see, the HOA Karen didn't follow proper procedures at all. The fine, if challenged, has very little chance of standing." The homeowner felt a mixture of relief and determination. Relief because someone confirmed what he had suspected. Determination because he now understood that winning would require patience and careful strategy. "You'll want to file a formal challenge," the lawyer continued. "Don't respond with money. Don't accept her threats. Gather your evidence and present it through the proper channels. The law is on your side if you follow the rules." Back at home, he spent hours organizing his materials. Each letter was placed in chronological order. Notes on conversations with the board member and neighbors were neatly recorded. Any piece of evidence that could show procedural errors or past rulings limiting HOA authority was highlighted. He even created a simple timeline showing when each action or letter had occurred. Neighbors began to notice subtle changes too. A few stopped by asking how he was handling the situation. They shared their experiences with the same board member stories of fines, threats, and public confrontations that had ultimately ended quietly because no one wanted to fight back. The homeowner listened, nodding, but kept the focus on his own preparation. He didn't need to argue with anyone, only to learn. The board member, meanwhile, continued her routine. She would walk around with her clipboard, stop by mailboxes, and occasionally make loud remarks about following the rules and setting examples. She assumed the fine would go uncontested, and that assumption was what gave her confidence. She had no idea that he was preparing, meticulously documenting every move and planning a formal challenge. One afternoon, he discovered another detail in the old court documents he had found. It was a prior judgment related to the property issued years before he had purchased it. The order placed limits on the HOA's authority, specifying that certain actions required formal notice and review before enforcement. Suddenly, a piece of the puzzle fell into place. The board member had no legal standing for this fine. She had overlooked or ignored the prior ruling. This discovery strengthened his resolve. He knew the challenge would not be easy. She would likely argue, threaten, and try to intimidate him in person and through letters. But he also knew that facts and evidence could not be ignored. He drafted a formal complaint to the HOA board. The letter outlined the procedural errors, referenced the prior court ruling, and requested a formal hearing. He included copies of his evidence, organized neatly, and sent it via certified mail. He kept a copy for himself and logged the delivery date. The waiting period was tense. Each day, he noticed the board member's presence in the neighborhood. She seemed more watchful, almost calculating. Once, she stopped and spoke to him briefly, her voice sharp. "You know the fine stands, right?" "I've requested a formal hearing," he replied calmly. "I'm following procedure." Her eyes narrowed, but she walked away without further comment. The brief exchange confirmed what he already knew. She assumed fear would make him comply. It had not. He also reached out to the attorney occasionally, confirming details, reviewing timelines, and asking about procedural nuances. The more he learned, the more confident he became. The key was staying calm and methodical, letting the evidence speak for itself rather than reacting emotionally to threats or intimidation. Neighbors continued to observe quietly. Some expressed subtle support, stopping by to ask questions or share experiences. Others simply watched from a distance, aware that the homeowner was standing up to someone many considered untouchable. The dynamic of the neighborhood began to shift. Fear slowly lost its grip as people saw that one person could challenge the board member and survive. One morning, another letter arrived, this time bolder than before. "Immediate action will be taken if payment is not received," it read. The language was designed to provoke panic, but he remained steady. He filed it with the others, noting the date, and added a note about its tone and threats. Each new letter, instead of creating fear, added more evidence to his growing case. In the days that followed, prepared for the hearing he had requested, he organized a clear, simple presentation, highlighting procedural errors, the absence of proper notices, and the limits imposed by the prior court ruling. He even practiced explaining the situation calmly, knowing that remaining composed in the hearing would be crucial. The homeowner also realized the importance of showing his character. He wasn't trying to antagonize the board or embarrass the board member. He was demonstrating fairness, honesty, and respect for the rules. That approach, he understood, would carry weight in the hearing and with any judge or mediator involved. HOA Karen, in the meantime, grew more restless. She continued to send letters, make subtle threats, and appear near his home more frequently. Her confidence was starting to show cracks. She was used to compliance, and he wasn't complying. Every day that he stayed calm and methodical was another day she realized her usual tactics might not work. Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. The homeowner gathered his notes, documents, and copies of every letter. He dressed neatly, but not formally, and approached the building with steady confidence. He had spent weeks preparing, and now it was time to present the facts. Inside the hearing room, the atmosphere was quiet but tense. The board member sat across from him, clipboard in hand, her expression sharp. She seemed ready to argue, to intimidate, to assert authority. But the homeowner remained calm. When the hearing began, he spoke clearly, presenting his evidence step by step. He showed the letters, the lack of proper notices, the procedural errors, and the prior court ruling. Each point was documented, each discrepancy highlighted. He stayed polite, factual, and firm, refusing to be baited into emotional arguments. The board member tried to interrupt, making claims and references without evidence. He responded only with facts, pointing to the documents and timelines he had prepared. The room remained silent, observers watching carefully. By the end of the hearing, the imbalance was clear. The homeowner had presented a methodical, documented case. HOA Karen relied on intimidation and assumptions, not evidence. It was a stark contrast that no one could ignore. After the hearing, the board needed time to review the materials. The homeowner left quietly, aware that he had done everything possible to ensure fairness. He felt a quiet sense of relief, knowing he had followed procedure and prepared thoroughly. The fine still loomed, but its power had diminished. Over the following days, the tension in the neighborhood grew. People speculated quietly about the outcome. HOA Karen appeared restless, no longer walking with the same sharp confidence. She had assumed victory, and the homeowner had challenged her assumption with facts, patience, and calm preparation. He continued to document everything, adding notes about her demeanor, new letters. In any subtle attempts to assert authority, he understood that patience and preparation would be essential until the final decision was made. By the end of the week, the homeowner felt a quiet satisfaction. He had turned a situation that could have been overwhelming into a controlled, methodical process. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't reacting emotionally. He was following the law, presenting facts, standing up for fairness, and in doing so, he began to see something he hadn't expected: the power of preparation and calm persistence. The board member, loud and intimidating for years, was facing her first real challenge in the neighborhood. The homeowner had learned a valuable lesson. Authority alone could not intimidate someone who knew their rights and acted methodically. Facts, patience, and proper procedure were stronger than threats. As he reviewed his notes one evening, he realized that the next step was coming. The hearing had set the stage. Now, the decision would determine the outcome, and he felt ready for whatever came next. He knew one thing for certain: the board member had underestimated him, and that mistake would soon have consequences. The day of the courtroom session arrived. The homeowner felt a mix of nerves and calm determination. Weeks of preparation had brought him to this moment. He dressed neatly, though not formally, and carried his organized folder of documents, letters, timelines, and copies of old court rulings. Every piece of evidence had been carefully reviewed, and every potential question anticipated. The courthouse was busy with the usual morning traffic of people waiting for various hearings. He noticed families, business people, and other homeowners milling about. Inside, the air felt heavier, quiet but tense, with the faint scent of polished wood and paper. He took a deep breath and reminded himself why he was here. Fairness, procedure, and truth. Once inside the hearing room, he saw HOA Karen already seated, clipboard in hand. Her sharp expression and tight posture suggested confidence. She had likely assumed this would be a quick, simple win. Most people would have paid the fine immediately, terrified of the consequences. She had assumed the same would happen today. The homeowner took a seat opposite her, placing his folder neatly on the table. He felt the weight of all the preparation he had done, but instead of fear, he felt control. Each document represented facts, proof, and clarity. He knew that calm, methodical presentation was far stronger than anger or confrontation. The judge entered, quiet and composed. Everyone rose briefly, then sat again. The homeowner noticed the attentive gaze of the court officer as the judge took their seat, signaling the beginning of the hearing. The board member spoke first, confidently presenting her case. She read from her notes outlining the alleged violations and stating the fine is justified. Her tone was sharp, her voice loud enough to assert authority but not overly aggressive. She assumed the room would accept her claims without question. The homeowner listened carefully. He had anticipated most of her points. When she finished, he calmly began presenting his case. He started by outlining the timeline of events, showing the dates of letters received or, importantly, not received. He highlighted the lack of proper notices, the absence of any hearing prior to the fine, and the failure to follow HOA procedures as outlined in the official handbook. When he presented the prior court ruling, the room went silent for a moment. He explained how the order limited HOA authority over specific actions and required formal procedures before fines could be imposed. He emphasized that the board member had bypassed each of these steps, making the fine invalid. HOA Karen tried to interrupt. She argued that the board had approved the fine and that he was simply refusing to comply. But the homeowner remained calm, holding up a copy of the evidence and pointing directly to the rules she had ignored. Each statement he made was backed by documents, dates, previous rulings. The judge listened intently, occasionally looking down at the documents and then back at the board member. "Is there proof of prior notices or warnings?" the judge asked, directing the question to the board member. She hesitated, fumbling with her papers. They were on record," she replied, her voice slightly strained. "On record?" the judge repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Could you provide documentation?" The board member shuffled her papers, clearly flustered. There was nothing concrete to show. Her confidence began to falter as she realized the strength of the homeowner's case. The homeowner continued, explaining how he had documented every interaction, every letter, and every attempt to clarify the situation. He spoke slowly and clearly, making sure the judge could follow the sequence of events without confusion. His tone was respectful, calm, and factual. There was no anger, no hostility, just truth as he spoke. The board member's expression shifted from confidence to visible concern. The realization seemed to dawn on her that she had overstepped, and that her reliance on intimidation had no weight against documented facts. The judge reviewed the documents again, comparing each letter, each notice or lack thereof, to the HOA procedures outlined in the handbook. Then the judge turned to the board member. "It appears that proper procedures were not followed. There are missing notices, and no opportunity for a hearing was offered. How do you respond to this?" She faltered, struggling to maintain composure. We followed what we believed to be the rules," she said finally, voice quiet. The homeowner remained calm. He simply nodded, letting the evidence speak for itself. There was no need to gloat or argue. The facts were clear, and the room recognized it. The judge then addressed the homeowner. "Thank you for presenting your documentation clearly and respectfully. Based on what I see, the fine imposed is not supported by proper procedure. It appears to be invalid." A subtle murmur ran through the room. HOA Karen's shoulders tensed, and she glanced around, realizing that her assumptions had failed. She had assumed fear and submission would carry the day. But the homeowner's preparation, patience, and adherence to procedure had turned the situation completely. The judge continued. "The fine of $3,900 is dismissed. Furthermore, the board must ensure that all future actions comply strictly with HOA procedures and respect homeowners' rights." The homeowner felt a wave of relief, but he remained composed. He had expected this moment, but he didn't react with triumph or anger. He simply nodded, acknowledging the judgment. HOA Karen, however, was visibly shaken. She had never experienced such a direct challenge, backed by evidence and procedure. Her attempts to intimidate, to rely on assumed authority, had failed completely. The room had seen that confidence without substance is fragile. Neighbors, who had come to observe, quietly expressed their relief. Some had been silently supporting the homeowner from the start, knowing the board members' tactics. They exchanged glances, realizing that one person's patience and preparation could make a significant difference. The homeowner gathered his documents and left the courtroom calmly. Outside, the sunlight felt warmer, brighter, and freer than it had in weeks. He had faced an unfair situation, prepared meticulously, and let the truth lead the way. It had worked. Over the next few days, the story spread quietly through the neighborhood. People whispered about the ruling, the board members' failed tactics, and the importance of standing up for fairness. HOA Karen maintained her position, but her influence seemed diminished. Her reliance on fear had been exposed. Residents began to see that intimidation was not absolute. The homeowner continued with his normal routine, tending to his home, checking mail, and interacting with neighbors. But now, there was a quiet sense of respect in the community. People recognized the power of methodical action, calm persistence, and careful documentation. He also reflected on the lessons learned. The experience had tested patience, restraint, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. It had shown that fairness and procedure are more powerful than loud threats or assumed authority. HOA Karen, meanwhile, seemed more cautious. She no longer walked around with the same sharp confidence, no longer made pointed remarks as boldly, and appeared aware that her usual tactics might not succeed in the future. The dynamic had shifted. The homeowner felt gratitude for his preparation, for the support of neighbors, and for the legal guidance he had sought. He understood that the moment in the courtroom was the turning point, but the real strength had come from careful planning, documentation, and patience. He didn't seek revenge, nor did he celebrate loudly. Instead, he quietly returned to his life, knowing he had upheld fairness and integrity. The $3,900 fine had been dismissed, but the deeper impact was the recognition that calm persistence, evidence, and truth could overcome intimidation and assumed power. And in that calm, methodical victory, he realized something more profound. Sometimes the quietest, most patient approach is the strongest one of all. After the courtroom decision, life slowly returned to a sense of normalcy, but things were no longer exactly the same. The homeowner felt a quiet relief, knowing that the $3,900 fine had been dismissed and that fairness had prevailed. Yet the experience had left its mark not as a wound, but as a reminder of the importance of preparation, patience, and standing up for what was right. The neighborhood began to notice subtle changes in HOA Karen's behavior. She was still present, still walking the streets with her clipboard, but her steps were slower, less confident. The sharp, controlling energy she had displayed for years seemed diminished, replaced with caution and an awareness that her previous tactics no longer held the same power. Neighbors, who had previously feared speaking up, now moved with quiet assurance. They had seen someone challenge the board and win, and it changed the dynamic in subtle but important ways. Small conversations at the mailbox, waves across the street, casual check-ins between neighbors all carried a new tone of confidence. People realized that HOA authority could not simply bully them if they knew their rights and acted methodically. The homeowner himself returned to his routines, tending to his home and yard, organizing his mail, and taking care of daily responsibilities. Yet he carried a sense of calm empowerment. The tension that had hung over him for weeks had lifted, replaced with quiet confidence. Every interaction with the board or the neighborhood now carried a subtle reassurance. He had stood up, done it correctly, and had been heard. HOA Karen, meanwhile, tried to regain control, but the courtroom outcome had changed the rules. Her past tactics letters, threats, and intimidation no longer carried the same weight. She attempted to send reminders and notes about community rules, but neighbors had seen her exposed. They were more informed, more careful, and no longer intimidated. Her presence no longer evoked fear. It evoked scrutiny. One afternoon, the homeowner noticed her approaching him across the street. She stopped a few feet away, clipboard in hand, but her demeanor had shifted. There was less confidence, more hesitation. "I hope everything is understood," she said quietly. We just want everyone to follow the rules." The homeowner responded calmly, keeping his tone neutral. "I understand. And I also understand the importance of proper procedure. That's what ensures fairness for everyone." Her shoulders tightened slightly, a subtle acknowledgement that the balance had shifted. She nodded and walked away, leaving him with the quiet satisfaction of a moment that spoke louder than words. Fairness had prevailed. In the following days, the neighborhood began to feel lighter. Small victories became noticeable. A neighbor who had once quietly paid fines without question now approached the board to ask for clarification on minor rules. Another resident, who had stayed silent for years, voiced a concern at a community meeting. Each act built confidence and shifted the energy of the neighborhood. The homeowner watched quietly, appreciating the change but not seeking attention. He didn't need to broadcast his victory. The results were visible in the calm, confident movements of neighbors and the cautious demeanor of the board member. People began to act with knowledge rather than fear. At home, he took time to reflect on the entire experience. He remembered the first letter demanding the $3,900 fine, the uncertainty it had caused, and the subtle tension in the air when HOA Karen walked past. He thought about the days spent documenting, the careful organization of letters and notes, and the hours reviewing legal documents and previous rulings. It struck him how much the situation had tested patience. Every time HOA Karen tried to intimidate him, he had to resist reacting emotionally. Every time she assumed compliance, he had to maintain calm and focus on facts. Each moment was a test of persistence, strategy, and restraint, and in the end, it had paid off.